Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the August 2024 Living Environment Regents Exam. In this video, we're going to be focusing on part B-1, which is 13 multiple choice questions, each worth 1 point. A link to this test can be found in the description of the video if you want to follow along at home, and a link to a video going over the next part of this test is also there if you want to keep on going over this exam after this video ends. That being said, we're going to start off with 31. Which tells us that catalase is an enzyme produced by organisms that break down hydrogen peroxide into oxygen and water. The relative enzyme activity, when tested at different temperatures, is shown in the graph below. So relative enzyme activity is just telling you how productive the enzyme is, aka how much the enzyme is producing, right? So enzyme activity is going to be controlled by temperature, pH level, and salinity. All of these three factors affect how productive an enzyme is or how active that enzyme is. In this case, we're dealing with temperature, which is one of these three factors. And the deal with temperature is that most enzymes have an ideal temperature that they work at. There's some sort of temperature range where they're the most active. And in high temperatures, if the current temperature of the environment exceeds or goes above that optimal range, that good range for that enzyme, the enzyme will change shape. So this question asks which statement below best explains the decrease in activity of catalase after 35 degrees Celsius shown in the graph. So if we look at this graph, it kind of forms this curve with this peak up here, right? There's this peak at 35 degrees Celsius, which means that this enzyme works the best in 35 degrees Celsius. I'm not lying to you guys, this is, again, an example of how temperature is related to enzyme activity. Low temperature is low activity, high temperature is high activity, but somewhere between those two extremes there is a value or a temperature where the enzyme works normally. And what ends up happening is that any temperature above 35 degrees Celsius, the productivity goes way down, it shoots down. And that's because at high temperatures, a lot of enzymes tend to change their structure. They tend to denature. So the correct answer here is going to be choice 1. The structure of the enzyme changes, which slows down the reaction. Okay, no hydrogen peroxide left. Choice 2 is wrong because we don't have any data about the amount of hydrogen peroxide left. Choice 3 is wrong because the raw materials permanently bind to the catalase, preventing the reaction. We don't know that. And 4, the reaction is no longer needed for the survival of the individual. Again, we are given no data about that. All we know is that after 35 degrees Celsius, the productivity goes down. And almost always, whenever you're dealing with an enzyme, the reason why that productivity goes down is because high temperatures change the shape of the enzyme. It makes them denature. 32 says, using a microscope, a student observed 4 different types of cells. For each structure he placed an X in the chart below to indicate the cells where the structure was observed. So we have cell membrane, cell walls, chloroplast, DNA, and nucleus. Which of the cells he viewed were most likely from heterotrophs? So heterotrophs are animals that make their own food. So they make their... that do not make their own food. Autotrophs make their own food. So in this case, a heterotroph is not going to make his own food. Now, the best example of an autotroph are plants. Plants are autotrophs. Why? Because they make their own food. They take the sun energy from the sun that radiates down on them. They absorb it inside of their leaves, and they turn it into sugar. And herbivores then eat those sugary plants, and then carnivores eat those herbivores, and that's where everyone gets their energy. So heterotrophs are animals that cannot make their own food. So the thing that allows plants to make their own food is the chloroplasts inside of their cells. Chloroplasts is what gives them this green pigment that then allows them to pick up the rays of the sun, the heat of the sun, or the energy of the sun, and convert that into sugars to be used to power their cellular functions. Plants also have cell walls, whereas non-plants or heterotrophs generally are not non-plant animals, have cell membranes, okay? So if we look at this, cells C and D lack chloroplast, so cells C and D, or D and C, have to be those heterotrophs, okay? So again, for this problem, you need to remember that heterotrophs are animals right? Because animals don't make their own food, while autotrophs are plants. What do plants have that animals don't? Chloroplasts. 33 says coleus is a type of plant that has many variations in its leaves. Many coleus plants have chloroplast-rich areas on the edge of the leaf. Other areas in the middle lack chloroplast. A student exposed the coleus leaf to sunlight. Later, a starch indicator was added to the entire leaf. The diagram shows the result of the experiment. So, which statement is a valid claim supported by evidence from the experiment? So before we look at the answer choices, let's just see what happens. Or let's just see what's happening here. So it's a type of plant. So both of these are coleus. And it has variation or differences. Variation means differences in its leaves. Many have chloroplast-rich areas on the edge of the leaf, okay? So remember, what are chloroplasts used for? They're used for photosynthesis. And what were we just talking about? Autotrophs undergo photosynthesis, where you take sunlight plus H2O plus CO2, and you turn that into sugar plus O2. Now, in this case, that's exactly what's happening. This is what happens inside of the chloroplast. So the chloroplast is taking in these elements and is producing this sugar and this oxygen, okay? So what they do is the student exposed the coleus leaf to sunlight and then put a starch indicator on the entire leaf. A starch is a sugar. Starches are sugars. And a starch indicator pretty much changes color whenever it comes into contact with a sugar. So all of these plants, or this leaf, was doused or placed inside of the starch indicator, and you can see here that it turned black or changed colors, aka indicating that there is sugar present on the edges of the leaf. And while don't all of the chloroplasts belong to the edge of the leaf in this plant species? Yes, they do, right? Other areas in the middle lack chloroplasts. So it makes sense that the starch indicator is added here because this is where all of the photosynthesis is occurring, and this is where all of the sugar is going to be found because that's where it's produced, in the chloroplasts, which are on the edge or outer edge of the plant, right? So which statement is a valid claim supported by evidence from the experiment? That's obviously going to be 3. Chloroplasts are necessary for the production of starch, right? If we know that the chloroplasts are located on the edge of the leaf, and it also, the only place with chloroplasts is the only place with sugar, then we can conclude that chloroplasts are what produce the sugar, right? Or they're important in the production of sugar. 4, water is necessary for the production of starch. We have no data or no indication about anything about water, so we can't choose 4. 2, starch indicator causes leaves to produce oxygen. Again, we have no data about the oxygen. 1, chloroplasts are necessary for the production of starch indicator. No, starch indicator wasn't produced here. We added starch indicator. Someone made starch indicator on their own, right, in this little bottle, and then they just added it to the plant leaf. 34 says, breathing vapors produced by e-cigarettes has caused respiratory problems, including coughing, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and even some deaths. Medical experts are warning the public and discouraging the use of these devices. Medical issues associated with vaping are example of what? Number 1, organ malfunctions caused by personal behaviors, right? That is exactly what they are, okay? Respiratory problems, it's issue with your respiratory system, which is your lungs, right? Mainly your lungs. So if you're coughing, if you have the shortness of breath, if you have difficulty breathing, and if you're dying, that's your lungs failing. Not entirely, but they're failing to function normally, which is a very, very big issue, right? If your lungs normally need to produce or provide your body with oxygen, but if you have a shortness of breath, then your body isn't getting enough oxygen because your lungs don't have enough capacity. If you're coughing, that means that there's something irritating your lungs, which is not normal, right? So your lungs are failing to function properly because they're getting irritated or they're not holding enough oxygen. And again, it's an organ malfunction, so it's not a failure, but it's not functioning the way it's supposed to, which is what malfunction means, and it's caused by personal behaviors. Why? Because it's your choice to smoke an e-cigarette, okay? 2, feedback response maintaining homeostasis. Like I just said, that's the opposite. Homeostasis is this balance that keeps you alive. It's supposed to make sure that your cells function properly. In this case, your body is not functioning properly because it's coughing and you have shortness of breath, right? you're not maintaining homeostasis, you're disrupting homeostasis by smoking. 3, inherited disorders from resulting from inhaling vapors. It's not an inherited disorder. No one is born with shortness of breath or coughing or difficulty breathing. They do it to themselves, right? They're smoking the e-cigarettes, and the e-cigarettes are causing the organs, the lungs, to malfunction, right? It's not, none of these are disorders. It's not like you have short breath disorder. You got short breath because you smoked, right? And because you damaged your lungs. 4, the effect of infectious parasites. Again, we're not talking about parasites here. 35, the chart below lists some organisms found in a New York ecosystem and their sources of energy. When constructed in an energy pyramid of the ecosystem, which organisms would be placed at the top? So whenever you're constructing an energy pyramid, I don't know why I did that. On the bottom are going to be producers. The second, I guess I can't erase that either, but the bottom is going to be the longest or the largest part of the pyramid, and that's going to be your producers. And then the second rung is going to be, herbivores, things that eat the producers. Then here you're going to have carnivores, and eventually at the top you're going to have the apex predators, right? So you're going to have predators closer to the top. So like I just said, number 1, grasses can't be at the top because grasses and producers are always at the bottom. There's always going to be at the bottom because they're the most abundant species, right? The sides of the pyramid also represents the size of the population of whatever's inside of it, right? So the producers have the largest amount of population. They're the largest population. So now we have to look at what each one of these eats. Well, the leopard frog eats insects and algae, which means that it's a herbivore, or pretty low on the food pyramid, right? Because it has to come after the producers. It's not at the top. So the leopard frog has to be eliminated. The carp eat plants, insects, and insects larvae. So because they're still eating plants, they're still low on the food pyramid. Why? Because, or the energy pyramid in this case, because they're still eating herbivore. They're still eating producers, so they are still herbivores. Okay. And finally, herons, which are these birds, eat carps, frogs, and salamanders. So herons don't eat any producer, which means that they have to be a level above the herbivores. And it makes sense because they eat carp, which are herbivores, they eat frogs, which are herbivores, and they eat salamanders, which are also herbivores. So if this energy pyramid only has 3 levels, then we can say that the grasses belong here, that the leopard frog and the carp belong here, and that the turtle and heron belong here because they eat that and those eat that. Okay, so it's always going to be organized from producer to herbivore to carnivore. Base your answer to 36 on the information and graph and your knowledge of biology. An unusually cool and wet spring prevented certain farmers from planting corn at the usual time. They normally planted their crop on May 1st, but altered weather patterns delayed planting until June 1st. Based on this information given, what is the most likely impact of delayed planting on the production of corn? Well, if you can't produce your corn reliably, then your corn yield is going to be decreased, right? Let's look at what happened here. The max percent of the yield. If you plant somewhere between April 5th and April 15th, you're going to get 90% of your maximum yield. So your yield is how much corn you usually get. So let's say you get 100 bushels of corn. If you're producing at a 90% yield, that means that you're not getting 100% of your bushels. You're not getting 100 bushels, you're only getting 90 because that's what 90% of 100 is. And as time moves on, you have this optimal range, right? If you plant your corn between April 25th and May 5th, you're going to be producing at 100%. So if you're normally producing 100 bushels of corn, you're going to get 100% of that, or 100. That's why the farmers want to plant their crop at May 1st, because May 1st is in between this range where you're going to get 100% yield, right? If you plant your crops any later, they're not going to develop, they're not going to develop as much, and you're going to get less of a yield, okay? But because the altered weather patterns, you're now planting your crops on June 1st. And if you plant something on June 1st, you're not even going to get 90% of your yield. You're going to get 80% of your yield, right? Or somewhere around 80% of your yield. So the impact on delayed planting is that the corn yield is reduced to up to 20% because you planted so late, right? The sooner you plant in this case, or the closer you plant to April and May, the more you'll end up producing. But the further away you'll plant, the less you'll produce, okay? Number one is false because if we look at the graph, no, the corn yield does not remain at 100% because of higher temperature in June, right? That doesn't make sense. If that was the case, then the graph would still be at 100% yield at around June, right? That's not the case. The yield went down. Three, the crop yield corn yield may be reduced to about 80% because of delayed planting. This is the trick answer here. Reduced by about 80%. If it was reduced by about 80%, if you're reducing something by 80%, 20% of it is remaining. So the reason why that's false is because 20% is not on this axis, right? At this point, which we are assuming is June 1st, corresponds to 80%. If I'm going from 100% yield to 80%, I'm decreasing by 20%, okay? I'm not decreasing by 80%. And choice 4 is wrong for all the reasons above, because clearly the graph doesn't show that. 37 says an ecologist is studying the biodiversity of beetle species in 4 different habitats. She counted the number of individuals of each species she observed in each habitat, and the results are shown in the data table below. Which one of these habitats displayed the most biodiversity of beetle species? So biodiversity is just how many different species you have inside of an environment. So something that has high biodiversity will have a lot of different species inside of an environment. So habitat Y is the opposite of being biodiverse. Again, diversity means you have a lot of different things in an environment. Habitat Y only has one type of thing. It only has one type of beetle. It has 120 of beetles that are species C, right? All of these other environments have some sort of other beetle, which means they have some sort of diversity. Now I need to see which one of these is the most diverse, and obviously that's going to be habitat X because it has one of every single beetle. If you have one of every single beetle, you have a broad range of beetles. You have all of them, which means that you're more diverse than everyone else because you have the most unique beetles. Okay, so the correct answer has to be 2, habitat X. Why isn't it habitat W? Well, because habitat W doesn't have beetle species A, B, or E. And why isn't it habitat Z? Because habitat Z doesn't have beetle species B or D, right? The more diverse you are, the more species you have. So it doesn't matter if habitat X only has 2 beetles that are species A. It doesn't matter. They still have some species A beetles, which makes them more diverse because it has more species. 38 says hummingbirds with their long beaks and tongues are attracted to long tubular flowers with a lot of nectar. When a hummingbird consumes the nectar from the flower, pollen sticks to the hummingbird and is transferred when the hummingbird feeds to other flowers. So when this guy feeds, there's going to be some sort of pollen that sticks to his fur, and then that pollen is going to be transferred to this flower, and then this flower's pollen is going to be transferred onto this hummingbird's beak, and then that's pretty much how it's going to pollinate other flowers. So this relationship between the flowers and the hummingbird is a result of what? Well, obviously it's going to be a result of natural selection of beneficial variations, right? The long flowers evolved longer tubes, right? Or they obviously no flower started off just being long and tubular, right? Eventually, natural selection favored these flowers with longer tubes because pollinators could easily access the pollen inside, right? It's a lot easier to distribute the pollen because the wind isn't blowing it across. And this hummingbird obviously evolved to have this longer beak so it can specifically reach inside of these tubular flowers to get the pollen that's located at the end of them. And well, these flowers kept on growing longer and longer because that's what gave them the most amount of pollen transfer. Okay, so it's always going to be the natural selection of beneficial factors. The reason why animals look the way they are or function the way they are is because of natural selection, right? A certain environment favors certain traits. In this case, the environment favored a longer beak, that's how hummingbirds evolved, and a smaller body. And in this case, the flower required its tube to be extra long to accommodate for a lot of the pollinators in the environment, which were hummingbirds, right? Number one, changing hummingbirds and flowers in response to their needs. Just because I want to be taller doesn't mean I'm going to be taller, right? Just because I have a need doesn't mean that my body is going to change to that need. That's not what happens. 2, inheritance of characteristics acquired during their lifetime. Again, that's not what happens, right? I can't inherit a new colored hair. I'm born with my current color of hair. The same way that I'm born with a certain height that I'm going to grow to, right? I can't really change that. 4, the environment modifying gene expression. Again, the environment is not modifying gene expression. No one is injecting new DNA into this hummingbird. That's not true. 39 says that the kittens are photographed below were all born in the same litter. One possible reason that they all have different fur color and fur patterns is that, number 1, different kittens inherited more chromosomes from one parent than the other. This is definitely false because every single species has a standard amount of chromosomes that they must have, right? Every single human needs to have 46 chromosomes. If they have 47 or 45, they have some sort of disability or illness, right? People with 47 chromosomes have Down syndrome because they have one extra chromosome. The same thing goes for the cats, right? All of these cats have a normal amount of chromosome, the same amount of chromosome number. So the chromosome number is always the same. It's not the different amount of chromosomes that makes you look different. It's going to be the random resorting of genes during the gamete formation of each parent that's going to result in this, right? You have 50% of the DNA from your mother and 50% of the DNA from your father, and this is going to mix inside of every single one of these kittens, right? They're not going to be exactly 50% of their mom, 50% of your dad. Why? Because when the sperm and the egg go ahead and they combine with one another, it's a random assortment or a random combination of that 50% from the mom and that 50% from the dad, okay? There's a random resorting of the genes during the gamete formation of each parent. So not only do the genes get mixed up in the middle of this fertilization, but when these gametes are even formed, when that sperm is formed or when that egg is formed, the type of 50% that they carry is also randomized, right? The chromosomes during this formation are recombinated. This part of the chromosome may end up on this part of the chromosome. This blue part of the chromosome may turn to red and be represented on this part of the chromosome. And when they split to be put inside of each of the sperm cells, you're left with chromosomes that are mixed, right? They have different amounts or different parts of information from different parts of the original gene that they're trying to carry. And what that means is that when they combine with the egg, which has the same thing, which has the same variation, the same different part of the chromosome mixed with another part of another egg's chromosome, there's going to be brand new variation. So each sperm is carrying a unique combination of the father's genetic information, and each egg is carrying a unique combination of the mother's information, genetic information. 3 and 4 don't make sense, right? Because pH differences during development aren't necessarily going to ensure, we don't know that to be true, right? We don't know if pH levels impact the color of a cat's fur. And 3, because there's so many, they did not receive the same amount of nutrients from the mother. The amount of nutrients you receive from your mother determines whether you're alive or not the color of your fur. So again, remember that there's always a random resorting of genes during gamete formation and later during fertilization. All right, 40 is based on this long paragraph, which says that a study was done to determine the effect of temperature increase on an ocean ecosystem. Panels equipped with heating elements were placed in an ocean floor 50 feet below the surface in the Antarctic Ocean. Some panels were heated so that they were 1 Celsius warmer than the water surrounding them. Others were heated to be 2 degrees Celsius warmer, and some were not heated. Over a long period of 9 months, the researchers returned to the site and documented the change in marine life that they observed. They noted that the 1 degree Celsius of warming resulted in a substantial change in marine life. One species of invertebrate grew rapidly and became the dominant species. It replaced multiple other species typically present in the area. The results were less consistent on panels that were 2 degrees Celsius warmer than the water surrounding them. The photographs on the right show the observations on the 3 sets of panels. So the control over here shows a good mix of these gray and white and black species. But when we increase the temperature by 1 degree Celsius, these gray species tend to overpower the rest of the species, right? There's more gray here. And finally, when you increase it by another degree Celsius, there's going to be less of a majority. But again, the main takeaway here is that when we had that 1 Celsius increase, that species of invertebrate took over the environment and reduced the biodiversity in that environment, right? You see a lot less amount of other species present. That's an issue because you want environments to be very biodiverse. So it decreases biodiversity in response to an increase in temperature, which shows that future warming of the Antarctic Ocean could be the disruption. A result of that could be a disruption of the existing Antarctic marine food web, because if you increase the temperature, you have a decrease in the biodiversity, which is ultimately going to impact the food web, because now, a food web is the animal 1 eats animal 2, who's eaten by animal 3 and animal 4. But all of a sudden, you have this increase in temperature, and now you no longer have any animal 1, which means that animal 2 starves, animal 3 and 4 also starve, right? So any decrease in biodiversity, or any instance where you have one species that's growing rapidly and becoming dominant, is an issue because it's disrupting the natural food chain, natural process. Okay, 41 says that a possible explanation for the differences observed in the panels is that, well, number 1, right, the growth of organisms is dependent on abiotic factors present in the environment, right? And this applies to every single organism that was there. It turns out that the organism that took over all of the other ones preferred a higher temperature. They survive, or they thrive in higher temperatures. Remember that temperature is an abiotic factor. Abiotic factors are non-alive or non-living factors like temperature, pH level, salinity, the amount of sunlight, right? None of those factors come from living things. The heat is just coming from the sun, which is not alive. So the growth of organisms do depend on abiotic factors, because the growth of all of these other organisms was heavily stunted or decreased in the presence of an abiotic factor, temperature, increasing. And, well, the growth of this dominant species was then hurt by that same abiotic factor, that same temperature, increasing later on to another 2 degrees Celsius. So that's why choice 1 is correct. Choice 2, on warmer panels, organisms reached carrying capacity more rapidly. That's not true, right? Because on warmer panels, you can't tell if there's carrying capacity reached. For all we know, this isn't even the carrying capacity here. It could all be covered with these gray organisms. We don't understand that. We aren't given that information. 3, on the control panels, waste builds up, poisoning some of the organisms growing there. Again, all we know is that the difference between the panels isn't the amount of waste there. It's, number 1, the type of organism and the amount of organism that's on those plates. And 2, it's going to be the temperature. In this case, plus 1 degrees Celsius on that plate, right? So those are the only 2 factors we're aware about. And those are the only 2 assumptions that we can make. We can't assume waste buildup or carrying capacity, because we're not given information about that. We're given information about an abiotic factor, which is temperature, and the amount of organisms there and their growth. And choice 4 is wrong because, again, we don't know if decomposers were there or not, right? 42 says that these test panels provided scientists with information about, choice 1, how ecological niches influence the rate of mutation. Did we ever talk about mutation in this problem? No, we didn't. We didn't talk about mutation here, so that shouldn't be a part of our answer. 2, the effect of environmental change on the biodiversity of the Antarctic Ocean. This is exactly what we were talking about, right? Environmental change can be temperature, salinity, exposure to sunlight. In this case, it was temperature. Environmental change, either the temperature is going up or going down. We were talking about an increase in environmental temperature, which is still environmental change. On the biodiversity, aka how many species are present in an environment, of the Antarctic Ocean. And what happened was when the temperature increased, the biodiversity went down because one species became dominant. 43 says that the kakapo is a small flightless parrot. Currently, there is a small population of kakapos living on 4 islands off the coast of New Zealand. Scientists are concerned that the kakapo may become extinct due to the introduction of predators and recent infections that have drastically reduced the already small population. During their conservation attempts, scientists made an interesting observation. When food is plentiful, more male offspring survive. Scientists provide the illustration below to explain this observation. So when food is scarce, due to the scarcity of resources, that son will be weak and unable to compete for a mate. Okay? So he is kicked out by another stronger male when the food is scarce. When the food is plentiful, that son may be healthy and strong and able to mate with many females to produce many offspring. Okay? So when the food is plentiful, more male offspring survive because they are stronger and won't be overcompeted for food and a mate. Right, so if scientists were going to test this hypothesis, the best way would be to select a test group and develop a research plan that includes collecting data when, and here we need to answer this question by showing how or explaining the optimal way of conducting this research, which is going to be choice 3. The kakapo test group is divided in half, and one half is fed unlimited food, and the other is fed the reduced amount of food. If I want to test their hypothesis, if I want to see, well, when the food is scarce, do more males actually get produced? And when the food is plentiful, do more males get produced? The way that I test this is by, making a study where half of the birds are given a lot of food and the other half of the birds are given no food, right? And I want to draw conclusions for this. For the entire test group of the kakapos is fed one type of food for a month and a different type of food for the second month. It's not about the type of food, it's about the amount of food. 2, all of the kakapos are fed an unlimited amount of food. Again, that wouldn't prove anything because if I keep feeding them plentiful food, I'm not going to be able to make any assumptions about when the food is scarce. 1, all of the kakapos are fed a reduced amount of food. The same reason, if I keep feeding them a reduced amount of food, sure, I'm going to see the effects of a reduced amount of food, but I'm not going to be able to compare it to when food is plentiful. So yeah, I can say that, when food is scarce, there's not a lot of males that survive, but when food is plentiful, I won't be able to make any assumptions about that because I didn't test for that. So the best type of experiment here is going to be one that tests for this situation up here and this situation up here as well. Okay, so that's the last question of the section. That's all of part B1 gone over, reviewed. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Other than that, a link to the next part of this exam or next part of this review is in the description of this video if you want to keep on going over this test. I hope you guys learned something and I hope you have a nice day.